So we found out recently that Dragon Age the Veilguard did not perform to expectations, is the technical term. What I was saying for a long time was it's really important to be clear about what the standards are, because expectations are different from profitability, okay? If I expect to lose $100, but I only lose 50, technically that transaction outperformed my expectations. I was expecting to lose more money and I lost less money. I still lost money, but I lost less money than I thought I would. So I'm actually happier. On the flip side, you know, even if I was expecting to make $100 profit, but I only made $50 profit, that can still be underperforming expectations. Doesn't mean it was a flop, but it means that it didn't meet my expectations. With Veilguard, it was pretty clear they expected this to lose money because it was in development for so long. They restarted development multiple times. It was going to be a live service game, and then they restarted it, turned it into, like, from a multiplayer game into a single player game. It had a messy development. So it was pretty clear that they expected it to be maybe a loss leader. I think they were hoping that it would rebuild some credibility and brand reputation and studio reputation before Mass Effect. And that's why they priced it low. That's why they cut out DRM. That's why they did all this stuff. But all of that only works if the game is like really, really good. So what we know is that they were expecting about 3 million copies. Still not enough to turn a profit on a game this size, but especially with all the marketing they did. But they only quote unquote engaged 1.5 million players, which was weird because they didn't say they sold 1.5 million copies. They said they engaged 1.5 million players. What that means, I don't freaking know, but it probably means that they're counting people who returned the game in that player count number. It means people playing with borrowed copies of the game. That counts. It means people playing on like family sharing copies of the game. That counts. So I think the number is inflated. They maybe sold like 1.2, 1.3 million copies or something like that. Either way, they lost money just like they expected to lose money, but they lost a lot more than they thought they would. And typically when a game underperforms, if it's kind of mysterious why it happened, you might see some layoffs, you might see some restructurings and stuff. But when there's a lot of blame to be passed around, there's not a very clear movement within the studio restructuring. It's just kind of like, okay, 5 people from QA, 10 programmers, 3 art people, and it's kind of widespread. With Veilguard, though, there was a universal criticism, which was the writing. Even people who left the previews kind of impressed. I left the previews, frankly, impressed because I was expecting a technical wreck, and it was actually quite polished. It was graphically really impressive, and they showed us very specific slivers of the game that were pretty cool. And they said there's a lot more moments like this, even bigger moments. There's bigger decisions to be made. This is only the first little sliver of the game. Turns out they showed us the only cool parts of the game, and then the rest of the game was just a friendship simulator, and it didn't go anywhere. And so when we got the entire game, it ended up being really underwhelming and disappointing, primarily because of the writing. Like, there's literally a point in the game where you're kind of, it's probably realistically, if you're playing the game the way they want you to do it, it's like halfway through. And there's a moment where one of the characters says, well, if we hope to stand any chance against the Elder Gods, we need to fix our friendships and personal problems. We'll only be able to fight them and win if we are like most connected or something. If we deal with our problems first or something. If we bond together better, to work as a team better. Like, they literally have this big build up. An entire city is destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of people die. And then they're like, time out. Let's focus on our friendship. And it's like laughable, but it's totally serious. And the ending is determined based on how many of those party members you befriended. The romances, which I mean, I'm just going to say it. I know 2 women in my life who are big Dragon Age friends or fans. And they, part of the reason they love Dragon Age is for the romances, for the relationship stuff. And they hated Dragon Age the Veilguard, primarily because of how the romances worked, because it was like, again, hilarious. You go romance this guy and he's like, would you like to have a coffee with me? And then you go have a coffee with him and it's like fade to black. And then it fades back in with them wearing slightly less clothes, but still pretty much dressed in like gym clothes. Like, wow, that was magical. let's have another coffee. It's like so hilariously stupid. And then there were other characters, you know, where there's like the whole thing with oh crap, what's the, oh god, what is, oh Tosh. Like one of the most insufferable characters I've ever seen, just whining and complaining about how mommy's being mean and rude, and like, but then Tosh is being extremely rude and nasty at the same time. Like just a cast of really lackluster, insufferable characters. And the way JV put it was brilliant. JV said in a tweet right as the game was launching, he was like, I've been playing Dragon Age Veilguard, and honestly, the dialogue is getting to me because it feels like a lot of therapy language. It's like, you know, when somebody goes to a lot of therapy and they start talking in a different way, and, you know, whenever they're talking to somebody who has like an anxiety or stress or some drama in their life, it's like, well, let me just start by saying, you're valid. Your feelings are validated. I appreciate you. We can work through this together. You know, it's therapy language. It's the type of thing you would expect your therapist to say to you. Problem is 99% of people don't talk like that. And it's freaking weird and inappropriate when there's like other things going on, like a city being destroyed. And then you have characters that are like complaining about like what clothes they're wearing or this other person's wearing. And you expect to be able to say, shut up. A lot of people just died. This is not the time to bicker and complain like this. You're an adult. Shut up. There's other more serious things happening. You would expect if you were going to take the story seriously that you'd be able to say stuff like that. But there was no dialogue like that in the game. The only dialogue in the game is like, well, I agree. Your feelings matter. And all we can do now is stick together. It's like, but the dragons come and it's killing my family. Well, as long as we've got each other, that's all that really matters. No, it doesn't. He just ate my little brother and my sister. Oh, he got my sister too. Well, we can go back to our base and drink some tea and talk around a campfire about how much we mean to each other. It's like, shut up. Makes it really hard to take the world or story or characters seriously when everything is so just out of touch, I think, because they don't talk the way that people actually talk. Jack is alluding to the SkillUp review. SkillUp said it sounded like all of the dialogue happens with HR sitting in the room because nobody actually like has big outbursts. Or I think also what it is everybody, it feels like all the characters are biting their tongues constantly because people don't talk like this. But I think the real problem with Dragon Age the Veilguard is that the writers talk like the characters do. They actually interact this way. This is normal, which is presumably why it came as such a shock that people didn't like the writing and found it really distasteful and weird and just cringe. But that's been the tale of the tape with a lot of games. I mean, Forspoken's the other famous one that was mocked roundly for its writing, even with just clips, unedited clips of Forspoken like leaked before the full game launched. And those went viral for how cringy and stupid they were. And the game was basically dead before it even launched because of those clips. And that nobody edited it. Nobody was like trying to selectively edit something to make it look bad. It was literally just crappy writing. And reportedly, members of the studio were shocked and like legitimately stunned that the reaction was so negative because they thought she was badass. They thought she was cool. They thought she was going to be the new Aloy, the new Ellie from the last. They thought that she was going to be the new centerpiece of a massive franchise for them. They genuinely had no idea people would think that the writing was so cringe. But it shows you how out of touch like the writers were with how actual gamers talk and feel and interact with the characters they're playing in games. And that's the part that you can't just choose a different route. The writers are bad. So what have they done? Well, as reported from VG247, it looks like the entirety of Dragon Age the Veilguard's main credited writing team is no longer working at BioWare. They basically have gone through and restructured stuff, restructured the company, and proactively, they've cut out almost every single writer that worked on Dragon Age the Veilguard. There's a couple of other people that are still there that wore multiple hats, but like they've pretty much gutted the company. Like, because as I said earlier, typically when a game underperforms and there's not a real clear person to point at, like, You just kind of downsize across the board. Everybody's teams get shrunk and you just try again. With this, though, it's clear where the problem was. Veilguard, if written by writers and competent people that knew what actual gamers wanted and didn't have this weird, like, contempt for gamers in general, too, where they're, like, lecturing them in the game about stuff. If they just wrote a compelling narrative with interesting characters and interactions that are grounded in real and feel genuine, the game would have been very impressive, I'm sure. The game was technologically very impressive. They cut out DRM, which is unheard of for like an EA game. It was really polished across the board. It was big in scope. I mean, it was single player focused, no microtransactions, no DLC. Like it had all the makings and trimmings of a compelling single player offering, but the writing was so god awful that it didn't matter. So it's pretty clear that that was the part that needed to be trimmed. As you can see in this article written by Mark Warren from VG247, every writer credited as being part of the main writing team on Dragon Age of Veilguard no longer appears to be working at BioWare, with a number of departures at various points in the past having been added by the studio's latest restructuring. Following the downsizing announced yesterday in a blog post penned by BioWare General Manager Gary McKay, Veilguard writing lead Trick Weeks posted on Blue Sky. I'm sorry. Out of all the places to post that this person's out of a job after writing Dragon Age: The Veilguard, I'm like, of course it's Blue Sky. Said, quote, now is looking for a new writing and narrative position as his 20 years at the studio have come to an end. Even the veterans aren't safe. Like, they're even booting out the people that have been there for decades. On top of this, fellow writer Brienne Bate, maybe, revealed that she's among those who have moved from BioWare to Motive Studio as part of the restructuring, with Cheryl Chi seemingly being in the same boat. Taking a look at the game's credits as listed on Moby Games and IMDb, you'll find those two names listed as part of Veilguard's main writing design team. And the key is, like, some of the like lower level writers are people that would be writing like the quips in combat, or maybe some of the individual dialogue between, you know, NPCs and cities and stuff. Not super crucial. Like, you want them to know what they're doing, but most of the problems with Veilguard come from on high. The early decisions for what types of characters were going to be in the game, how they were going to interact, what the dynamics were going to be. Does this character like this other character? Do they interact well? Does this person dislike certain types of people or certain things? And they're very adamant about that. Like, all of those decisions happen very, very early on and very high up. And these are the people that were booted out. As you can see, Anne LeMay says, I was a writer at BioWare for 5 years from 2011 to 2016. I learned a lot during that time from exceptional folk in many disciplines, but also specifically from my fellow writers and our amazing editors on both Mass Effect and Dragon Age brands. Today, not a single one of those writers and editors remains employed there. I think what happened, because to be clear, this is that Anne is saying from 2011 to 2016. Oh God, I accidentally opened Blue Sky. Oh no. No. From 2011 to 2016, all those amazing editors and writers that worked on Mass Effect and Dragon Age during that time period, none of those people are still there. And this is why the pivot to like live service stuff, the change in direction, all of this can have massive implications years down the road. Because look at Rocksteady. Rocksteady decides to pivot into Suicide Squad. As a result, a lot of the people that were working on the single player games like Arkham Knight, Arkham City, those people left. Some of them left with the studio founders to make another studio in London to make a different game before Suicide Squad even launched. But a lot of those people that made those single player games left because they didn't want to work on a live service game. They didn't want to work on multiplayer stuff. They wanted to make single player games. So they left because their expertise wasn't needed there. And with Dragon Age and what happened with BioWare, they made Mass Effect Andromeda. That was a dumpster fire. Nobody wants to be on board a sinking ship. So if you just were working on a team that launched a disaster, you might be open to moving and finding a different job somewhere else, because nobody wants to work on a disaster. People want to have their name attached to successes. So those people start leaving and going to other teams and other studios that want their talent. And then they release Anthem, which is their attempt at a live service game. Absolute disaster as well. A lot more single player experts and writers and staffers leave during that time, because what we found out later was that in the same time period as Anthem was being made, around like 2019, guess what the next Dragon Age was supposed to be? A multiplayer game. So a lot more single player people, writers and staffers and RPG designers, start leaving if they hadn't already. And then they decide sometime during COVID, you know what? No, we're going to make the next Dragon Age a single player game. But by that point, all of that talent had left, and they were left with some new hires and some OGs that have been there for a while, but they were hiring new people. They were trying to build out a new writing team, but the studio that people knew and loved was gone. It had fundamentally changed. And you can't just Control Z that. You can't just get it back. Once those people are gone and they've moved to other studios, they're gone. And I think we see now the long-lasting side effects of hiring new people that don't have a real appreciation and understanding of the franchise. And it's also the danger with this modern approach where it's like fresh perspectives and modern perspectives are always of value. No, not always. Like, freaking Dead Rising 4. They brought in a whole new team for that game. They didn't even require that team of developers to play the other Dead Rising games before making Dead Rising 4. What? And so as a result, you get a game that doesn't really feel like Dead Rising. And with Dragon Age, you get a game that doesn't even feel like Dragon Age, because none of the people that built Dragon Age, except for like a couple very senior people that had been there for 20 years, but very, very high level and quite evidently didn't really understand what Dragon Age fans wanted out of it. Those people are left behind, but all of the new writers, all the new staff, they just don't know what those gamers want or what those fans want, and thus they're unable to deliver it. Of those others, however, Sylvia, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to try to mispronounce that, announced that she was departing BioWare last month after 15 years. Courtney Woods left the studio to join Ghost of Yotei developer Sucker Punch in 2022. This was was Courtney one of the writers? Yeah. So Courtney Woods, who was one of the writers on Dragon Age the Veilguard, left a handful of years ago to work on Ghost of Yotei. Oh, I found it. Hold on. I found what I was looking for. Because when you see something like that, there's something you should be aware of. Just to keep an eye on it. If somebody is working on a dumpster fire that was a dumpster fire because of its writing, and then that person moves to another game that kind of hinges, I just hit myself on the head, that kind of hinges on the writing quality, just pay attention to it, okay? Game could be amazing. Ghost of Yotei could be amazing. Really love Ghost of Tsushima, but you got to be aware of that, because the last thing she was working on was a dumpster fire primarily because of the writing, and she was like a senior writer. So just something to keep in mind. John Dombrow made a move to the same studio as Woods did a year later. Who's John? Meanwhile, both Mary Kirby and Lucas Kirstensen look to have been let go from BioWare in August of 23. Finally, Joe Barry is listed in Moby Games as credits for Veilguard, and according to her LinkedIn page, left BioWare for a writing position at Motive in 2017. That's 9 writers, unless the most recent departures end up being brought back in some capacity on the latest Dragon Age game, no longer working for BioWare, at least on a full-time basis. Veilguard game director Corinne Bush also revealed earlier this month that she's leaving BioWare to work on a new RPG elsewhere. Given that, despite what idiots on the internet might say, Veilguard was far from an unmitigated disaster of a game, even if it didn't hit the potential overzealous targets EA set for it financially. I don't know if 3 million copies was overzealous, my friend. I don't know. I mean, okay, so there's 2 pieces here. We've talked about this before. I have a degree in corporate finance. I'm literally certified to talk about this, okay? Literally, I know what I'm talking about here. You're right. Sports FC 25 struggling was responsible for the primary drop in revisions and in the stock market freakout that kind of occurred after the fact. However, Dragon Age the Veilguard it missed expectations by 50%. I don't think 3 million copies was that unreasonable of an expectation, frankly. If anything, I consider that to be quite conservative for a massive AAA game in a very well-known franchise. Like Dragon Age, the last Dragon Age game won Game of the Year in 2014. It's not like you're launching a new IP, you know? Like 3 million, I don't know if that's overzealous. In hindsight, maybe it's overzealous, but like, I think maybe we're reframing a little bit if we're acting like they expected way too much of it. It'll be sad. It'll be sad if indeed the entire writing team behind it, aside perhaps from some localizers who are listed as part of the other teams, have indeed either been shown the door or departed the studio on their own terms, especially since many were longtime Dragon Age series stalwarts who'd also worked on previous entries in the series. I think regardless of how long you've been working on the franchise, how long you've been at that studio under that roof, if you were part of the team responsible for the one thing everybody agrees was bad, at some point you should be held like responsible. I don't understand why that's that controversial. Like if you were working on the writing staff and everybody agrees the writing was bad, that is on you. Why should we like make excuses for you because you've been there a while? Like if you're on the QA team for Fallout 76 and the game launches and is an unmitigated technical disaster, that still lands on you. Like I understand maybe there's other things going on that maybe made it difficult or complicated, but like ultimately, if you're responsible for the thing that sucks, you shouldn't be surprised when you get punished for it sucking. You know, I don't understand why we should make excuses for it. So I can't say I'm shocked at the departures, at the layoffs, at the restructurings and things. It's, I think, perfectly expected to a certain degree. I think, you know, ideally we see them bring in some other talent. We see them really take a long, hard look before Mass Effect at what went wrong. And, you know, I don't think you can teach an old dog new tricks when it comes to writing and stuff, because what the writers think is compelling, you're not going to convince them otherwise of. Like, they put out what they thought gamers, or maybe not what they thought gamers would like, what they thought gamers needed. They put out what they thought was compelling and what they thought was good. And the fact that it was so not shows that they probably should not be entrusted to write something like that again. Because if they honestly thought that that was good, we have a much bigger problem. It's the same with like, you know, the character designs in a Concord or something, where it's like so laughably bad that it's like, okay, if you thought that this was good, oh no. You know, like we got bigger fish to fry if you thought that that was really, really good. So I think it's probably the best thing for BioWare that they are going through and redoing stuff, and they're going to be hiring different developers and different teams. I think that that is the best move for them. It's unfortunate, sure, when people lose their jobs, but at some point, like, it's just like with Herman Holst. You lose billions of dollars, you probably should lose your job. I don't think that's that surprising. If you are the writer on a game that is a massive disappointment financially because of the writing primarily, at some point, like, the blame does land on you. You're a senior writer on the game that everybody hates the writing on. Like, you know, I just don't understand how anybody could be defending it and acting like it's not that big of a deal. Or, yeah, or it'd be like Herman and fail upward. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh my God. And all of this leads us to the follow-up on this discussion of Dragon Age, which is that now it looks, as you can see from this article from Insider Gaming, it looks as though BioWare has less than 100 people left working at the studio. That's coming from a report from Jason Schreier. The company now sits at less than 100 employees after having over 200 just 2 years ago. The report says that a number of employees who were put temporarily on new teams were informed that those moves were permanent. No longer were they BioWare employees helping out in a different area. Schreier's report also corroborates Insider Gaming's exclusive report that dozens of people were let go as part of a new wave of layoffs at the studio. Quote, if they want to work at BioWare again in the future, they would have to look for a job openings and reapply, Schreier writes. He adds that for now, at least, a small team will work on the next game in the Mass Effect series. This team is being led by company veteran who oversaw the development on the original trilogy as well as on 2019's Anthem. The goal is to then expand as needed later on in production. As sources told Insider Gaming, after the memo from BioWare was released, there is still an internal evaluation being done in order to see where things can be improved. There is still a worry from those who spoke under condition of anonymity that more layoffs and moves within the studio are coming. Neither EA nor BioWare have responded to requests for comments, blah, blah, blah. At the very least, to EA's credit, they're not being shut down. It seems now they are getting to make Mass Effect 5. But it's one of the other more fascinating occurrences in the industry because I, again, can't think of another studio that has, let's not use the word flop because that might upset people. Let's use massive financial disappointments. I can't think of another studio that has had 3 games that massively disappointed financially in the form of Andromeda, Anthem, and now Veilguard. And that studio and team still gets to exist. Cash flow errors. I like that, dog. That's good. Or cash flow challenged, maybe. I can't think of another studio that has like 3 massive plops like that still gets to keep going. So to their credit, EA's like, well, we're gonna let you try with Mass Effect, but I was pretty sure that this was the last train, and like they got to figure it out. They got to hop on board or they're left behind. And apparently they're being given the chance to do Mass Effect as well. Surprising, frankly, but I mean, who knew? As for what that actually looks like, I mean, I hope that they learned the lesson from Dragon Age, because it'll be really easy for them to just make the same mistakes over again. And I mean, now, like, if anything, the pressure to have high quality writing will be even higher than for many other studios, because now everybody's going to be looking at it with a magnifying glass to see, you know. It's like I remember a guy in the middle of like the Starfield stuff came and was like, oh, the standards and expectations for Bethesda are super unreasonable. They're way more unreasonable than for other studios. Look at these clips from other games of bugs that happened in their games from these other studios. And nobody really caused a big fuss about it. But, you know, Starfield has one big bug with, you know, the ship's not loading in or something, and everybody loses their minds. And it's like, yeah, the standards shift and evolve and change for different studios. Sure, it's not fair. Sure, in theory, everything should be totally equal. But once you've demonstrated a proclivity for certain types of mistakes, you shouldn't be surprised when people start hyperfixating on that to see if you've made the mistake again. If Bethesda has a history of technical problems and bugs and load screens and stuff, everybody's going to be watching for the load screens in Elder Scrolls 6, and that shouldn't surprise you. Even if you can point to other open world games that have some load screens happen here and there, it just is what you're dealing with. And you can choose to be upset that reality is the way that it is and people have standards that they do, or you can just deal with it and respond to it. That's why I've said a bajillion times, perception is the reality you have to deal with. And with this, I think you just can throw a fit about people having the standards that they do, or you can try to meet those standards and rise above it. And if you rise above it, just like Yash says in chat, like how KCD had a lot of bugs, now KCD2 is relatively bug free. Exactly. They understood, like, well, we could complain about people being frustrated about the bugs and stuff and the polish because we're a small team and this is like our first big project, and so we could complain about it, or we could just release the sequel that's super polished and super refined and ready to go. Good to go. And we'll rise to the occasion and we'll surpass expectations. Do that. So anyway, Dragon Age, the Veilguard, at this point, it's pretty clear that, you know, it was a massive disappointment for EA. It was not what it needed to be, certainly, but somehow they're being given another chance. Somehow. So we'll see. We'll see if they can figure it out. He took my thing.